Some promises we make without thinking will ever matter again. Others change everything, even when spoken by a 6-year-old girl to a powerful emperor. Little Livia tugged at Emperor Septian's crimson cloak during a village procession and declared, "I shall marry you when I grow up." He laughed and promised to wait for her, never imagining she would return. 17 years later, Livia comes back to the imperial court. She's no longer a child, but a wise woman shaped by loss and learning. The emperor remembers her instantly. What started as innocent words from a little girl becomes something deeper when two hearts meet again across the years. But can a childhood promise become real love when both their lives have been changed by time and duty? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The marble halls of the imperial palace echoed with the soft whisper of sandaled feet against polished stone. Emperor Septian moved through the corridors with measured steps, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, the purple stripe on his toga catching the late afternoon light that streamed through tall windows. At 69, he carried himself with the dignity of a man who had learned that true authority came not from commanding others, but from mastering oneself. The sounds of the city drifted up from below, merchants calling their wares, children laughing in the streets, the gentle clip-clop of horses pulling carts laden with grain and olive oil. This was Valentia, a prosperous province on the edge of the empire, where the Mediterranean sun warmed golden stones and life moved with the comfortable rhythm of a place that had known peace for 3 generations. Septian paused at his favorite window, one that overlooked the main thoroughfare leading to the forum. From here, he could see the daily life of his people unfold like a familiar scroll. The baker's wife swept her doorstep with the same methodical strokes she had used for 20 years. Old Marcus still sat on his worn wooden stool, mending sandals with fingers that remembered every stitch. The fountain in the square sparkled with fresh water, surrounded by women filling clay jars while their children played tag between the columns. This was his world, not the grand spectacle of Rome with its gladiators and political intrigue, but a place where governance meant ensuring the grain stores were full. The aqueducts ran clean, and disputes were settled with wisdom rather than sword. He had chosen this posting 17 years ago, after a lifetime of military campaigns and senatorial debates had left him weary of the capital's endless machinations. "Your Excellency." The voice belonged to Marcus Flavius, his chief advisor and closest friend, a man whose loyalty had been tested in a dozen campaigns and never found wanting. Flavius approached with a scroll in his weathered hands, his graying beard neatly trimmed, his eyes holding the comfortable familiarity of shared years. "The grain reports from the northern settlements," Flavius said, offering the parchment. "The harvest looks promising this year. The rains came at the right time, and the farmers are optimistic." Septian accepted the scroll, but didn't immediately unfurl it. Instead, he continued to gaze out at the street below, his mind elsewhere. "Do you ever think about the promises we make, old friend?" Flavius raised an eyebrow, a gesture Septian had seen countless times over their decades of friendship. "In what context, Excellency?" "The casual ones. The words we speak without thinking, believing they'll be carried away on the wind and forgotten." Septian's voice held a reflective quality, the tone of a man who had lived long enough to understand that time had a way of making prophets of fools and fools of the wise. The advisor moved to stand beside his emperor, following his gaze to the bustling street. "I've learned that the gods have a sense of humor about such things. The oaths we swear with great ceremony are often broken within the year, while the careless words spoken in passing sometimes shape the very course of our lives." A slight smile touched Septian's lips. 17 years ago, in that very square, a little girl made me a promise. The child who declared she would marry you." Flavius chuckled softly. "I remember her well. Bold as brass, that one. Barely tall enough to reach your knee, yet she spoke to you as if addressing an equal. Livia." The name came easily to Septian's lips, as if he had spoken it often in the intervening years, though he had not. She had dirt under her fingernails and flowers in her hair, and she looked at me without a trace of fear or awe. Just a child speaking her truth to the world, and you promised to wait for her. I did. Septian's eyes grew distant. I never expected to see her again. Children that age, their families move on, settle elsewhere. Life takes them down paths we can't predict. But I've thought of her often, wondering what became of that fearless little girl. The scroll in his hands remained unopened as memories washed over him like waves against a familiar shore. That day had started like any other. He had been conducting his monthly procession through the city, a tradition he had established to remain connected to his people. Unlike the grand imperial spectacles of Rome, these were modest affairs, Septian walking among his citizens, listening to their concerns, settling minor disputes, ensuring that the distance between ruler and ruled never grew too great. He remembered the weight of the summer sun on his shoulders, the way the crowd had parted respectfully as he made his way toward the temple of Jupiter. Children had pressed forward as they always did, drawn by the novelty of seeing the emperor up close. Most hung back shyly, but not Livia. She had appeared at his elbow as if materialized from the air itself, a small hand tugging at his cloak with surprising determination. When he looked down, he found himself staring into the most serious brown eyes he had ever seen, set in a face that spoke of intelligence and mischief in equal measure. "Emperor Septian," she had said, her child's voice carrying clearly despite the murmur of the crowd. "I have something important to tell you." The formality of her address, coming from someone who could not have been more than 6 years old, had delighted him. He had knelt to her level, bringing his weathered face close to hers, noting the way she didn't flinch or step back. "And what might that be, young citizen?" "I shall marry you when I grow up." The declaration had been made with the absolute certainty that only children possessed, as if she were announcing that the sun would rise or water would flow downhill. "You're a good emperor. My grandmother says so. And you have kind eyes." The crowd had fallen silent, waiting to see how their ruler would respond to such audacity. Septian had felt laughter bubbling up from somewhere deep in his chest. But it wasn't mocking laughter. It was the pure joy of encountering someone who spoke without calculation or hidden motive. "That's a very generous offer," he had replied gravely, matching her serious tone. "But you're quite young, and I'm quite old. Are you certain you want to wait so long?" "I'm sure," she had nodded emphatically. "I'm very patient, and by the time I'm grown up, you'll need someone to take care of you." The simple wisdom of those words had struck him more forcefully than any philosophical treatise. Here was a child who understood something about the nature of partnership that many adults never grasped, that love was not just about passion and desire, but about caring for one another through all of life's seasons. "Very well then," he had said, extending his hand formally. "I, Emperor Septian of Valentia, do solemnly promise to await your return when you are grown." She had clasped his much larger hand in her small ones and shaken it with the gravity of a senator sealing a treaty. Then, with a smile that could have melted bronze, she had curtsied, a surprisingly graceful gesture for one so young, and melted back into the crowd. He had looked for her throughout the rest of the procession, hoping to speak with her family, but she seemed to have vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared. In the days that followed, he had made discreet inquiries, but no one seemed to know who she was or where she lived. It was as if she had been a gift from the gods themselves, a moment of pure joy in what had become a rather predictable life. "You never forgot her," Flavius observed, noting the distant look in his friend's eyes. "How could I? In a world full of people who tell you what they think you want to hear, she was the only one who spoke from her heart, without fear or agenda." Septian turned from the window, finally unrolling the grain report. "She reminded me why I chose to serve here rather than seek advancement in Rome. Sometimes it takes a child to show us what we've lost sight of." The two men walked slowly back towards Septian's private chambers, their footsteps creating a comfortable rhythm on the marble floors. The palace was modest by imperial standards, more like a well-appointed villa than the sprawling complexes that housed the Caesars. Septian preferred it that way. Grand architecture could inspire awe, but it also created distance, and he had learned that effective leadership required connection, not intimidation. His chambers reflected his philosophy. The furniture was well made, but not ostentatious. A desk of polished olive wood, chairs with comfortable cushions, shelves lined with scrolls containing not just official documents, but poetry, philosophy, and histories. A small shrine to the household gods occupied one corner, while another held a collection of gifts from grateful citizens, a bronze stylus from the Scribes' Guild, a small amphora of excellent wine from a vintner whose land dispute he had resolved, a carved wooden horse from a child whose father he had helped find work. It was a room that spoke of a man who found meaning in service rather than power, who measured success not by the fear he inspired, but by the trust he earned. The courier arrived this morning from Rome, Flavius mentioned as they settled into their chairs. The usual reports, tax receipts, troop movements, political gossip that grows staler with each mile it travels. Septian nodded absently, his mind still partially focused on memories of a little girl's serious promise. Anything requiring immediate attention? Nothing urgent. Senator Claudius sends his regards and mentions that your reputation for fair governance has reached even the capital. There's talk of offering you a position on the Imperial Council. The offer should have pleased him. Recognition from Rome was the goal of most provincial governors. Instead, Septian felt a familiar weariness settle over his shoulders like a heavy cloak. And leave all this? The people who have come to trust us? The work we've built here? The work would continue. My replacement would be some ambitious young senator eager to use Valentia as a stepping stone to greater things. Within a year, he'd be looking for ways to increase tax revenues and curry favor with his patrons in the capital. The people would suffer for his ambition. Flavius had heard this argument before, but he pressed gently. You won't live forever, my friend. Eventually someone else will govern here regardless. At least if you choose your successor, when that day comes, we'll face it, Septian interrupted, but not harshly. For now I'm content to serve where I am. This place has given me more satisfaction than all my years in Rome combined. As if to punctuate his words, voices drifted up from the courtyard below, a group of children playing, their laughter bright and carefree. Septian found himself wondering if any of them possessed the same fearless spirit as the little girl who had captured his imagination so many years ago. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that reminded him why poets wrote about Mediterranean evenings. Soon, the day's work would end, and he would dine simply in his quarters, perhaps read a bit of Virgil or Marcus Aurelius, and then sleep the peaceful sleep of a man whose conscience was clear. It was a good life, perhaps not the life he had imagined in his youth when glory and advancement had seemed the highest goals, but a life rich with purpose and connection. He had learned that happiness was not something to be pursued, but something that arose naturally from right living, from treating others with dignity, from finding meaning in service rather than self-aggrandizement. Yet on quiet evenings like this one, when the responsibilities of the day had been discharged and the palace grew still, he sometimes found his thoughts returning to a little girl's promise. Not because he expected her to return. Time and distance made such things impossibly unlikely, but because she had represented something precious that he had almost forgotten existed. The possibility of connection without calculation, love without condition, hope without cynicism. In his youth, he had dreamed of conquest and glory. In middle age, he had pursued influence and position. Now, in the twilight of his years, he understood that the greatest victories were often the quietest ones. A province governed with wisdom, disputes settled with justice, people allowed to live in peace and prosperity, but sometimes, just sometimes, A man could still dream that the universe held surprises yet to be revealed. The scroll in his hands contained good news. Full granaries meant another year of security for his people. It was the kind of practical blessing that had taught him to find joy in simple things. Children well fed, roads well maintained, disputes resolved with words rather than swords. Tomorrow would bring its own responsibilities and rewards. Tonight, he would be content with the satisfaction of duty fulfilled and the gentle hope that somewhere in the world a little girl had grown into a woman who still remembered the power of a promise freely given. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern hills when the messenger arrived at the palace gates, his horse lathered with sweat and dust from hard riding. Marcus Flavius received the dispatch in the outer courtyard, noting the official seal of the provincial council and the urgency in the young rider's eyes. From the northern settlements, "Sir," the messenger reported, still catching his breath, "an envoy approaches from the mountain territories. They request an audience with Emperor Septian." Flavius frowned slightly. The mountain settlements were autonomous regions that rarely sent formal delegations. Their people were fiercely independent, descendants of ancient tribes who had negotiated their freedom rather than submit to conquest. Trade agreements and boundary disputes were typically handled through intermediaries, not direct appeals to the emperor. "What manner of envoy?" he asked, accepting the scroll and breaking the wax seal. "A woman, sir. A scholar by all accounts. She carries credentials from the Academy of Athens and speaks of representing her people in matters of trade and territorial rights." The contents of the message confirmed the messenger's report, but provided few additional details. The delegation would arrive within 2 days, led by one, Livia Marcella, described as a learned woman trained in rhetoric, philosophy, and law. The Mountain Council requested formal audience to discuss matters of mutual benefit between their territories and the province. Flavius dismissed the messenger with instructions for rest and refreshment, then made his way to Septian's chambers. He found the emperor in his private garden, tending to a small grove of olive trees that he had planted himself years earlier. It was one of Septian's peculiar pleasures, working the soil with his own hands, finding peace in the simple rhythms of cultivation and care. "We have visitors coming," Flavius announced, settling onto a stone bench beneath the shade of a fig tree. "An envoy from the mountain territories. A woman scholar seeking audience on matters of trade." Septian straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. The mountain folk rarely trouble themselves with formal diplomacy. "What's prompted this change?" "The message doesn't specify, but the envoy carries impressive credentials. Trained in Athens, fluent in law and rhetoric. Her name is Livia Marcella." The name fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. Septian felt something shift in his chest, a quickening of pulse, a sudden sharpening of attention that had nothing to do with diplomatic protocol. "Livia," he repeated softly, testing the familiar sound on his tongue. "It's a common enough name," Flavius said carefully, though his eyes suggested he understood the direction of his friend's thoughts. "Surely you don't think—" "No!" Septian's response came too quickly, betraying the very possibility he sought to dismiss. "Of course not. It would be—" he paused, considering. "It would be beyond the realm of reasonable expectation." Yet even as he spoke the words, something deep within him stirred, not quite hope, but a recognition that the universe occasionally arranged coincidences that defied probability. The little girl who had made him a promise had possessed an unusual name, one that suited her serious nature and quick intelligence. Could she have made her way to the mountain territories? Could she have acquired the education and credentials described in the message? The questions multiplied faster than he could examine them, each one building upon the last until his rational mind struggled to contain the growing sense of anticipation. "When do they arrive?" he asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. 2 days hence, according to the messenger. "I'll arrange suitable accommodations in the guest quarters and schedule the formal audience for the afternoon of their arrival." Septian nodded, turning his attention back to the olive trees, as if the conversation held only routine significance. But his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his gardening tools, and his mind raced with calculations of time and possibility. 17 years. A 6-year-old child would now be 23, precisely the age when a serious young woman might complete her studies and take on the responsibilities of representing her people. The mountain territories were exactly the sort of place where someone might seek refuge or a new beginning, far from the structured confines of provincial life. He forced himself to focus on practical matters. If this woman, whether his Livia or another entirely, came seeking trade agreements or territorial adjustments, he would need to review the existing treaties and understand the current state of relations with the mountain settlements. Diplomatic preparation would provide a welcome distraction from the increasingly insistent voice in his mind that whispered of destiny and fulfilled promises. The next 2 days passed in a blur of nervous energy, disguised as increased attention to administrative duties. Septian found himself reviewing and re-reviewing documents that required no such scrutiny, rearranging meetings that were perfectly well scheduled, and taking long walks through the palace corridors that led nowhere in particular. Flavius watched these uncharacteristic displays of restlessness with growing amusement. He had known Septian for more than 30 years, had seen him maintain perfect composure in the face of military defeat and political crisis. Yet the mere possibility of an old memory made flesh had reduced the steady emperor to pacing his chambers like a caged lion. "Perhaps you should consider what you'll say if it is her," Flavius suggested on the evening before the delegation's arrival. Septian paused in his restless circuit of the room. "What does one say to a promise made in childhood? Hello, I've been waiting." "The very notion is absurd." "Is it? You did promise to wait. I was humoring a child. No reasonable adult would—" He stopped, recognizing the trap in his own words. If this woman was indeed the little girl from his memory, then she had carried that promise with her through 17 years of growth and change. That suggested either remarkable sentiment or serious intent, neither of which could be dismissed as mere childhood fancy. Besides, he continued more quietly, what could I offer her? I'm an old man nearing the end of his service. She's a young scholar with her life ahead of her. The mathematics of the situation are unkind. Mathematics, Flavius observed dryly, have never been the strongest foundation for matters of the heart. On the morning of the delegation's arrival, Septian found himself changing his toga 3 times before settling on his most formal attire, the purple-striped garment reserved for important state occasions. He told himself it was merely appropriate respect for visiting dignitaries, but the care he took with his appearance suggested deeper motivations. He positioned himself in the throne room well before the appointed hour, reviewing his prepared remarks and trying to calm the unfamiliar flutter of nerves in his stomach. The great doors remained closed, but he could hear activity in the outer courtyard, the sounds of horses, the murmur of voices, the measured footsteps of the honor guard forming their ceremonial lines. Flavius entered and took his position at the emperor's right hand, carrying the scroll that would formally introduce the visiting delegation. His expression was carefully neutral, but Septian caught a glimpse of anticipation in his old friend's eyes. "They've arrived," Flavius reported unnecessarily. "Shall I have them brought in?" Septian straightened in his chair, drawing upon decades of experience in maintaining imperial dignity even when his private thoughts churned like storm-tossed seas. "Yes, let us receive these mountain delegates with the honor due to visiting scholars and representatives of free peoples." The words came out steady and formal, betraying nothing of the anticipation that had coiled itself around his heart like a vine seeking sunlight. In moments, he would know whether the universe had chosen to honor a child's promise or whether he had allowed hope to override wisdom. The great doors swung open with their familiar creak of bronze hinges, and the honor guard announced in unison the delegation from the mountain territories, led by the scholar Livia Marcella. Septian's breath caught in his throat as the first figure stepped through the doorway. and into the shaft of morning sunlight that slanted. Across the marble floor, she was tall and graceful, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to respect and attention. Her dark hair was arranged in the elaborate style favored by educated women, held in place with pins of polished silver. Her chiton was well made, but not ostentatious, dyed the deep blue that marked her as a person of learning and standing, but it was her eyes that stopped his heart. The same serious brown eyes that had looked up at him 17 years ago, now set in a woman's face marked by intelligence, determination, and something that might have been recognition. She paused 3 paces from the throne, executed a perfect formal bow that acknowledged his rank while maintaining her own dignity, and when she straightened, her gaze met his directly without flinch or hesitation. "Your Excellency," she said, and her voice carried the same clear tone he remembered, now deepened by maturity and strengthened by education. "I am Livia Marcella, scholar of Athens and representative of the mountain territories. I come seeking audience on matters of mutual interest to our peoples." A pause stretched between them, pregnant with recognition and possibility. Then so quietly that only he could hear, she added, "I have kept my promise, Emperor Septian. I told you I would return when I was grown." The silence that followed Livia's quiet declaration stretched across the throne room like a held breath. Septian felt the weight of 17 years collapse into a single moment of recognition so profound it threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. Every detail of that long-ago afternoon rushed back with startling clarity. The warmth of summer sun, the press of the crowd, the small hand tugging at his cloak with such determined purpose. "My lord?" Flavius's voice came from what seemed like a great distance, though he stood mere paces away. The concern in his tone suggested that Septian's reaction had been more visible than intended. With effort that felt almost physical, Septian gathered the threads of his imperial dignity and wove them back into place. He was Emperor of Valentia, receiving a diplomatic delegation in the formal setting of his throne room. Personal revelations, no matter how extraordinary, must yield to protocol and propriety. "Welcome, Livia Marcella," he said, his voice carrying the measured authority of his office. "Your arrival honors us, and your credentials speak of scholarship that commands respect. We are pleased to receive you and your delegation." But even as he spoke the formal words, his eyes never left her face, searching for confirmation of what his heart already knew. The shape of her jaw, the arch of her brows, the way she held herself with quiet confidence, all were echoes of the fearless child who had changed the course of his thoughts with a handful of words. She inclined her head gracefully, accepting the formal welcome while her own gaze remained steady on his. "Your Excellency is gracious. I bring greetings from the Council of the Mountain Territories and hope that our discussions will prove beneficial to both our peoples." Indeed, Septian rose from his throne, a gesture that surprised Flavius and caused a subtle ripple of reaction among the attending guards. Emperors rarely stood to greet provincial delegations, but 17 years of wondering had earned this moment whatever breach of protocol it required. "We shall convene a formal session tomorrow to address the matters that bring you here. For now, allow us to offer the hospitality due to distinguished guests." He stepped down from the dais, closing the distance between them to something approaching conversational rather than ceremonial. "Marcus Flavius, my chief advisor, will see that you and your companions are provided with suitable quarters and refreshment. The journey from the mountains is arduous, and you must be weary from travel." "Your thoughtfulness is appreciated," Livia replied, but her eyes held a question that transcended diplomatic courtesy. The little girl, who had spoken so boldly to an emperor, had grown into a woman who understood the delicate dance of public discourse, yet something in her expression suggested she, too, was struggling with the weight of recognition and memory. "Perhaps," Septian continued, his voice carefully neutral, "you would join me for an informal discussion this evening? The customs and concerns of the mountain territories are not familiar to me, and I would benefit from your perspective before we engage in formal negotiations. It was a reasonable request. Governors often sought private briefings from visiting dignitaries, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed deeper motivations. Flavius's raised eyebrow suggested he understood precisely what his emperor was arranging, though he was too well trained to comment. "I would be honored," Livia answered, and for just a moment, her formal composure slipped enough to reveal something that might have been anticipation or relief. The rest of the ceremony proceeded with mechanical precision. Introductions were made to the other members of her delegation, two mountain elders whose weathered faces spoke of lives spent in harsh but beautiful country, and a young scribe whose nervous energy marked him as new to such formal proceedings. Gifts were exchanged according to tradition: fine pottery from the mountain kilns, silver worked in patterns that echoed the peaks and valleys of their homeland, and from Septian's treasury, bolts of silk and sealed amphorae of the region's finest wine. But beneath the ritual courtesies, Septian found his attention drawn again and again to Livia herself. The child he remembered had possessed an unusual gravity for her age, but the woman she had become carried herself with a dignity that spoke of challenges faced and overcome. There were subtle lines around her eyes that suggested both laughter and sorrow, and a steadiness in her bearing that came from hard-won wisdom rather than mere learning. When the formalities concluded and the delegation was escorted to their quarters, Septian remained in the throne room, staring at the space where she had stood. The morning sunlight had shifted, and dust motes danced in the air where her voice had carried that impossible, wonderful confirmation of identity. "Well," Flavius said into the silence, "that was unexpected." "Was it?" Septian turned to his friend, searching for any sign of prior knowledge or arrangement. "Did you know? When you read me the message about her coming, I suspected nothing. The name was intriguing, but as I said, it's common enough. Besides, what were the chances?" Flavius paused, studying his emperor's face with the familiarity of decades. "Though I confess, seeing her, hearing that voice, there's no mistaking it, is there?" "None." Septian moved to his favorite window, looking out over the city that had been his charge for so many years. Somewhere in the guest quarters, the little girl who had promised to marry him was settling into rooms that would house her for at least several days. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. She kept her word, Flavius. Against all reason and probability, she actually kept her word. Children make many promises. Most are forgotten before the next sunrise. What does it mean that she remembered this one? It was the question that had been circling Septian's mind since the moment of recognition. A child's declaration of intent to marry could be dismissed as innocent fantasy, but a woman's decision to seek him out after 17 years suggested purpose and consideration that demanded serious response. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." The afternoon passed in a blur of postponed meetings and rearranged schedules. Septian found himself unable to focus on routine administrative matters, his mind constantly returning to the woman who had introduced herself as Livia Marcella, a name that honored both her childhood identity and her adult accomplishments. As evening approached, he dismissed his servants and prepared for their private meeting with unusual care. Not the formal attire of state occasions, but his finest everyday toga, freshly cleaned and pressed. He had his barber trim his beard and arrange his graying hair with more attention than usual, then immediately questioned the vanity of such concerns. What did it matter how he looked? 17 years had marked them both with the inevitable changes of time. The eager child who had tugged at his cloak was now a serious scholar, and the middle-aged governor, who had knelt to her level, was now an elderly man whose best years lay behind him rather than ahead. Yet when a servant announced her arrival at his private chambers, Septian felt his pulse quicken with an anticipation he had not experienced in decades. Whatever this meeting revealed about her motivations or intentions, it would answer questions that had haunted his quieter moments for nearly 2 decades. "Show her in," he instructed, and found himself straightening his shoulders unconsciously, as if preparing for a judgment whose outcome would reshape everything he thought he knew about fate, promise, and the strange persistence of human hope. The door opened, and Livia Marcella stepped into his private world, no longer the formal envoy, receiving official welcome, but a woman keeping a promise made by a child to an emperor who had never quite stopped waiting for her return. Livia entered Septian's private chambers with the same measured grace she had displayed in the throne room, but away from the formal setting and watching eyes. Something in her bearing softened almost imperceptibly. She paused just inside the doorway, her gaze taking in the comfortable furnishings, the shelves lined with scrolls, the small shrine to the household gods, and the bronze oil lamp that cast warm light across weathered olive wood. "This is not what I expected," she said quietly, and for the first time since her arrival, her voice carried traces of the directness he remembered from childhood. Septian gestured toward a pair of chairs, arranged near the window, where the last light of evening painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. "What did you expect?" "Something grander, I suppose. More imperial." She moved to the chair he indicated, but remained standing, her fingers trailing along its carved armrest. The stories they tell about provincial governors usually involve marble statues and golden couches, not reading chairs and garden herbs drying on windowsills. "Stories have a way of growing in the telling," Septian replied, settling into the opposite chair. "Wine? I have an excellent vintage from the northern hills, not quite as fine as what they produce in your mountains, but respectable." She nodded, and he poured from a simple clay pitcher into 2 matching cups, good pottery, but the sort used for daily meals rather than state banquets. She accepted hers with both hands, a gesture that struck him as somehow careful, deliberate. "You remember me," she said. "It was not a question, from the moment you stepped through those doors. 17 years, and I would have known you anywhere." He sipped his wine, using the pause to study her face in the lamplight. "The question that intrigues me is whether you truly expected me to remember, or whether you hoped I might." A smile touched the corners of her mouth, the first genuine expression of amusement she had allowed herself since arriving. "I thought you might. You were very kind to a presumptuous little girl, and kindness tends to leave an impression. But I wasn't certain until I saw your face when I said my name." "And what did my face tell you?" "That Emperor Septian keeps his promises, even the impossible ones made to children." The weight of those words settled between them, like stones dropped into still water. Septian found himself studying her with new attention, not the diplomatic assessment of a visiting dignitary, but the deeper consideration of a man trying to understand a woman whose very presence challenged his assumptions about the nature of time, chance, and commitment. "Tell me," he said, leaning forward slightly, "how does a fearless 6-year-old from Valentia become a scholar representing the mountain territories?" The path between those 2 points cannot have been simple. Livia took a longer sip of wine, and when she spoke, her voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had learned to present information clearly and persuasively. "My family moved to the mountains when I was 8. My father had acquired debts in the city, gambling mostly, though he called it investment. The mountain councils offered him work overseeing their trade routes in exchange for a fresh start. And you adapted to mountain life. Children are resilient. I learned to read the weather, to identify safe paths through the peaks, to understand the mountain people's ways. But more than that, I discovered they valued learning in ways that surprised me. They may live simply, but they maintain libraries that would impress scholars in Athens or Rome." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the window where stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "The mountain councils believe that wisdom is the greatest wealth, and they're willing to invest in anyone who shows aptitude for learning. When they realized I had a gift for languages and rhetoric, they sponsored my education in Athens for 6 years. Philosophy, law, rhetoric, mathematics. I studied under masters who taught me to think clearly and argue persuasively. But I never forgot where I came from, or the promise I made to a kind emperor who took a little girl seriously when no one else would have." The admission hung in the air between them, and Septian felt something shift in his chest, not quite relief, but a recognition that her presence here was not mere coincidence or diplomatic convenience. She had come seeking him deliberately, carrying 17 years of intention and purpose. The mountain councils must have specific concerns to send their finest scholar as an envoy, he observed, allowing the conversation to move towards safer, more practical ground. They do. Livia set down her cup and leaned forward, her manner becoming more focused. The trade routes through our territories have grown increasingly valuable as commerce with the eastern provinces expands. But we've noticed changes in the taxation policies, new levies that weren't part of our original agreements with Rome. Ah, Septian nodded, understanding. You're feeling pressure from the capital. Someone in Rome has noticed that the mountain passes generate significant revenue and wants a larger share. Precisely. Our autonomy has always depended on our agreements with the provincial government rather than direct dealing with Rome. If those agreements can be modified unilaterally, then your independence becomes worthless. Septian finished the thought, his mind already working through the political implications. Who's behind the pressure? Do you know? Senator Marcus Crassus has been appointed to review provincial revenues. His agents have been asking detailed questions about our trade volumes and suggesting that our tax arrangements may need updating. Septian's expression darkened. He knew Crassus by reputation, a man who viewed provincial territories as sources of wealth to be extracted rather than communities to be governed. If Crassus had set his sights on the mountain territories, their traditional autonomy was indeed under threat. That explains the urgency of your mission, he said, but not the choice of envoy. Why you specifically? For the first time since entering his chambers, Livia looked uncertain. Her composure, so perfect during their formal introduction and maintained throughout their conversation, showed hairline cracks as she considered how to answer. Because, she said finally, the mountain councils believed that our best chance lay not in legal arguments or political maneuvering, but in appealing to an emperor known for his fairness and wisdom. They chose someone who might have a personal connection that transcended mere diplomatic protocol, someone who made a promise to marry me 17 years ago. Yes, the word came out barely above a whisper, and in it, Septian heard layers of complexity he was only beginning to understand. The mountain councils had not simply sent a skilled negotiator. They had sent someone who carried a unique claim on his attention and, potentially, his loyalty. And what? He asked carefully. Do you believe about that promise now? As a woman rather than a child. Livia met his gaze directly, and in her eyes he saw not the calculation of a diplomat seeking advantage, but something far more personal and far more dangerous to his peace of mind. I believe, she said, that some promises are worth keeping, even when they seem impossible. Especially then, the morning after their private meeting, Septian found himself walking the palace gardens before dawn, his mind turning over Livia's words like a scholar examining a particularly complex text. The air carried the cool freshness that preceded sunrise, and the olive trees he had planted years earlier rustled softly in the gentle breeze from the sea. Some promises are worth keeping, even when they seem impossible. Especially then, the words had echoed in his thoughts through a largely sleepless night. What did she mean by them? Was this merely diplomatic strategy, an appeal to his sense of honor designed to secure better terms for her people? Or was there something deeper, more personal in her carefully chosen phrase? He paused beside the fountain at the garden's center, watching the water catch the first rays of sunlight as they crested the eastern hills. 17 years ago, he had been a different man, still vigorous, still believing that the future held unlimited possibilities for reinvention and achievement. Now, at 69, he understood that time was not an infinite resource, and that the choices remaining to him were fewer and more consequential than those he had faced in youth. "Early morning for reflection," came Flavius's voice from behind him. His old friend approached with 2 steaming cups of herb tea, a peace offering and invitation to conversation. Sleep proved elusive, Septian admitted, accepting the warm cup gratefully. Too many questions, not enough answers. Would you like to share the questions? Sometimes speaking them aloud helps clarify the mind. Septian considered this, then nodded slowly. What does a 69-year-old emperor offer a 23-year-old scholar? What does she truly want from me? And perhaps most troubling, what do I want from her? Flavius settled beside him on the marble bench that encircled the fountain. Complicated questions. Let's start with the simplest. What does she want? From a diplomatic perspective, that seems clear enough. Protection for her people's autonomy. Relief from Crassus's taxation schemes. The influence of a provincial governor who has earned Rome's trust. Septian sipped his tea, letting the warmth spread through his chest. All reasonable requests that I'm inclined to grant regardless of our personal history. Then why does her presence trouble you so much? Because I sense there's more to her mission than diplomacy. The mountain councils could have sent any skilled negotiator. Instead, they chose the one person in their territories who carries a unique claim on my attention. He paused, watching a pair of sparrows splash in the fountain's shallow basin. That suggests either remarkable political calculation or something more personal. And which do you hope it is? The question hung in the morning air, like incense from a temple altar. Septian found himself reluctant to examine his own motivations too closely, sensing that honesty might reveal desires that were both foolish and dangerous for a man of his age and position. I don't know, he admitted finally. Part of me hopes she's here purely for her people's sake. It would be simpler, cleaner. We could negotiate an agreement that serves everyone's interests, and she could return to her mountains with her mission accomplished. And the other part? The other part remembers a little girl who looked at an emperor without fear and made a promise she somehow kept for 17 years. That part wonders what manner of woman grows from such a child, and whether the connection I felt that day was real or merely the sentiment of a man growing old alone. Flavius was quiet for a long moment, his weathered features thoughtful. You've governed wisely for many years by keeping personal feelings separate from public duty. Why should this situation be different? Because this isn't just personal feeling, it's something I've never encountered before. In my youth I loved passionately but briefly. In middle age, I formed partnerships based on mutual benefit and genuine affection. But this, he gestured helplessly, this is built on memory and promise, possibility and recognition. I don't have experience to guide me, then perhaps you should let the situation guide you. See what develops naturally, without forcing outcomes or overthinking motivations. Before Septian could respond, a servant appeared at the garden's entrance, bowing respectfully. Your Excellency, the mountain delegation requests audience when it pleases you. They are prepared to begin formal discussions. Very well. Inform them we shall convene in the smaller council chamber within the hour, and ask Marcus Flavius to review the existing trade agreements with the mountain territories. I want current terms clearly understood before we begin. As the servant departed, Flavius rose and placed a gentle hand on his emperor's shoulder. Remember, my friend, whatever else she may be, she is also a skilled diplomat representing her people's vital interests. Don't let personal considerations blind you to political realities. Wise counsel, Septian agreed. Though I suspect the challenge will be determining where personal ends and political begins. An hour later, the smaller council chamber, a more intimate space than the throne room, with a polished table surrounded by comfortable chairs rather than formal seating arrangements, hosted the mountain delegation. Livia had chosen to wear a chiton of deep green that complemented her olive complexion, with her hair arranged in a simpler style that suggested scholarly seriousness rather than diplomatic formality. The mountain elders, introduced as Gaius Montanus and Marcus Silvius, proved to be shrewd negotiators who understood their position's strengths and weaknesses with admirable clarity. They presented their case methodically, detailed records of trade volumes, copies of existing agreements, and evidence of the new taxation. Pressures that threatened their community's traditional way of life. Septian found himself impressed by their preparation and moved by their obvious devotion to their people's welfare. These were not ambitious politicians seeking personal advantage, but community leaders genuinely concerned about preserving a way of life that had flourished for generations. The autonomy agreement signed during Emperor Hadrian's reign, Gaius Montanus explained, unrolling a carefully preserved document, guaranteed our communities the right to self-governance in exchange for maintaining the trade routes and providing scouts for the frontier garrisons. We have honored our obligations faithfully, yet Senator Crassus argues that changing circumstances require updated arrangements, Marcus Silvius added, his tone carefully neutral, but his expression revealing his opinion of such arguments. Senator Crassus, Septian observed dryly, believes that every provincial arrangement should be reviewed for maximum revenue extraction. His perspective tends to be narrowly fiscal rather than broadly political. Can his pressure be resisted? Livia asked, speaking for the first time since the formal presentations began. Our research suggests that provincial governors have significant discretion in interpreting existing agreements, but we're uncertain about the extent of Rome's ultimate authority. It was a sophisticated question that demonstrated real understanding of imperial administrative structure. Septian felt a familiar stir of intellectual appreciation, the pleasure of engaging with a mind that could match his own in complexity and subtlety. The answer depends, partly on legal interpretation and partly on political relationships, he replied. Legally, existing agreements carry the force of imperial decree and cannot be modified unilaterally. Politically, however, a determined senator with the right connections can create pressure that makes resistance costly. And your position? She pressed gently. Would supporting our autonomy create difficulties for your own governance? The question cut to the heart of the matter, and Septian found himself studying her face as he considered his response. Was this the scholar seeking information, or the woman testing his commitment to their shared past? My position, he said finally, is that promises made by the empire should be honored, regardless of political convenience. Valentia's prosperity has always depended on trust. Trust between ruler and ruled, between trading partners, between communities that must cooperate despite different traditions and interests. He paused, letting his gaze meet hers directly. Some promises are worth keeping, even when powerful people find them inconvenient. Especially then. The formal negotiations continued for 3 days, and with each session, Septian found himself increasingly impressed by Livia's diplomatic skills. She possessed an unusual ability to listen carefully to what was said, while simultaneously understanding what remained unspoken. A talent that marked the difference between competent representation and genuine advocacy. More troubling for his peace of mind was the way she seemed to inhabit the space between her roles as diplomatic envoy and the woman who carried memories of a childhood promise. During formal discussions, she maintained perfect professional composure, asking precise questions and offering thoughtful responses that advanced her people's interests. But in the quiet moments between sessions, when documents were being arranged or refreshments served, he caught glimpses of something more personal in her manner. Your Excellency, she said on the third afternoon, as the mountain elders reviewed proposed amendments to their trade agreements, might I impose upon your time for a brief private discussion? There are aspects of our situation that require more delicate handling than public session allows. It was a reasonable request. Diplomatic negotiations often required confidential exchanges, but something in her tone suggested this conversation would venture beyond the purely professional. Septian found himself both anticipating and dreading what she might reveal. They met again in his private chambers, but this time the atmosphere felt different. The initial awkwardness of reunion had passed, replaced by a more complex tension that spoke of recognition gradually deepening into something more substantial. The formal agreements are proceeding well, Livia began, settling into what had apparently become her preferred chair. Your support for our autonomy will make enormous difference to my people. But there's something else I need to discuss, something that affects both our situations. Septian waited, noting the careful way she chose her words. Whatever she was about to reveal had been weighing on her mind throughout their negotiations. Senator Crassus's interest in our territories isn't purely fiscal, she continued. He's also been investigating provincial governors who might be vulnerable to pressure. Governors whose loyalty to Rome might be questioned if circumstances changed. A chill ran down Septian's spine. What kind of investigation? The kind that looks for personal relationships that might compromise official judgment. The kind that asks why a provincial governor shows unusual favor to particular communities or individuals. She met his gaze directly. The kind that might find our childhood promise very interesting if it became known. The implications struck him like a physical blow. If Crassus suspected that Septian's support for the mountain territories was based on personal rather than political considerations, it could provide grounds for challenging his authority or even questioning his fitness for office. How much does he know? Septian asked, his mind already working through the potential consequences. Nothing specific yet, but his agents have been asking questions about our delegation, who we are, why we were chosen, what connections we might have to the provincial government. It's only a matter of time before someone remembers a little girl who spoke boldly to an emperor 17 years ago. And if they make that connection, then our childhood promise becomes a weapon against both of us. He could argue that your judgment is compromised by personal sentiment, that you're placing individual loyalty above imperial interests. Livia's voice remained steady, but he could see the concern in her eyes. It would destroy your reputation and make my mission appear to be manipulation rather than legitimate diplomacy. Septian rose and moved to his favorite window, looking out over the city that had been his charge for so many years. The afternoon sun cast familiar shadows across the forum, where citizens went about their daily business in peaceful ignorance of the political currents that might soon disrupt their ordered world. What do you suggest? He asked without turning around. Complete our negotiations quickly and formally. Secure the agreements that protect my people, then end any association between us that could be construed as personal rather than official. Her voice caught slightly on the last words. I return to the mountains, you continue governing Valentia, and our childhood promise becomes nothing more than a pleasant memory. Is that what you want? The question surprised him. He hadn't intended to ask it so directly, but something in her manner, the slight tremor in her carefully controlled voice, suggested that she was proposing a course of action that served practical necessity rather than personal desire. What I want, she said quietly, is for my people to remain free and for you to continue serving yours without threat or compromise. Everything else is secondary to those obligations. He turned from the window to study her face, noting the way she held herself with careful control, as if maintaining composure required conscious effort. That's not an answer to my question. It's the only answer that matters. No. He moved back to his chair, leaning forward to close the distance between them. What matters is truth. What do you want, Livia? Not as an envoy or representative, but as the woman who kept a promise for 17 years. For a moment, her diplomatic mask slipped completely, and he saw vulnerability that took his breath away. I want to believe that some things transcend politics and calculation. I want to believe that connection can exist between two people despite differences in age and station and circumstance. I want to believe that the little girl who looked at an emperor and saw only kindness wasn't foolish to carry that memory into adulthood. She paused, gathering her composure. But I also understand that wanting something doesn't make it wise or possible. We live in a world where personal desires must yield to larger responsibilities. And if those responsibilities could be managed, if there were a way to honor both duty and desire, then I would want to explore what might be possible between us, she admitted. But I won't ask you to risk everything you've built for the sake of exploring possibilities. Septian felt something settle in his chest. Not relief exactly, but a recognition that the woman before him possessed the same courage and integrity that had marked the child he remembered. She was willing to sacrifice her own happiness for his welfare and her people's security, just as she had once been willing to speak truth to power without calculation of consequence. "What if I told you," he said carefully, "that I'm not willing to simply send you back to the mountains and pretend that 17 years of wandering never happened? What if I believe that some risks are worth taking, especially when they involve honoring promises made to fearless little girls? Then I would tell you that you're a remarkable man, and that the child who made you a promise chose more wisely than she knew." Livia's smile was both sad and hopeful. "But I would also remind you that remarkable men have responsibilities that extend beyond their personal happiness, true, but they also have the obligation to recognize when the universe offers gifts that transcend ordinary expectation." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. 17 years ago, you promised to marry me when you grew up. I promised to wait. Neither of us expected those promises to be tested by reality, and now that they have been, now I think we owe it to ourselves and to that little girl and the man who knelt to her level to discover what those promises might mean when made by two adults who understand their weight. Her fingers tightened around his, and for the first time since her arrival, he saw hope unclouded by diplomatic caution in her eyes, even if it's dangerous. Especially then. The letter arrived on the 4th morning of Livia's stay, carried by a courier whose dust-covered appearance and exhausted horse spoke of urgent travel from Rome. Flavius received the imperial dispatch personally, noting the seal of the Senate and the formal markings that indicated official business of the highest priority. He found Septian in the garden, sharing an early breakfast with Livia beneath the olive trees, a scene of quiet intimacy that would have delighted him under different circumstances. The developing connection between his emperor and the mountain scholar had been evident to anyone with eyes to see, and Flavius had watched with growing satisfaction as two people he had come to respect discovered something precious in each other's company. But the letter in his hands carried news that would shatter the gentle peace of morning conversation, like a stone through glass. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his grave tone immediately alerting both of them to the seriousness of his news. "An urgent dispatch from Rome requires immediate attention." Septian set down his cup of honey-sweetened tea and accepted the scroll, his experienced eye taking in the formal seals and imperial markings before breaking the wax. As he unrolled the parchment, Flavius watched his emperor's expression shift from curiosity to concern to something approaching shock. "What is it?" Livia asked, her diplomatic instincts clearly sensing that whatever news the letter contained would affect more than just provincial administration. Septian read the document twice before looking up, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. "Senator Marcus Crassus has been appointed as Special Commissioner for Provincial Revenue Review, with full authority to investigate and modify existing agreements between Rome and autonomous territories. His commission specifically mentions the mountain regions and their irregularly generous tax arrangements. When does this take effect?" Livia's voice remained steady, but Flavius could see her hands tighten around her cup immediately. "He's already en route to Valentia, with a full investigative staff and legal authority that supersedes provincial governance in matters relating to his commission." Septian continued reading, his voice growing more troubled with each line. "He's expected to arrive within 10 days. The implications hung in the morning air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Crassus's arrival would not simply threaten the mountain territory's autonomy, it would subject every aspect of Septian's governance to scrutiny by a man who already suspected personal motivations behind official decisions. "There's more," Septian continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. "The commission was requested by Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself, following reports of irregularities in provincial management that suggest personal relationships may be influencing official policy. Livia's cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the stone table with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. They know. Somehow they already know about us. It would appear so. Septian set the letter aside and reached for her hand, noting how cold her fingers had become. The question is how much they know, and whether we can respond before Crassus arrives with predetermined conclusions. Flavius cleared his throat diplomatically. If I may, Excellency, what specifically does the Commission authorize? Are we speaking of review and recommendation, or does Crassus have power to make immediate changes? Full authority to modify existing agreements, reassign territorial governance, and recommend changes in provincial leadership if he deems such measures necessary for imperial interests. Septian's voice was steady, but the weight of the words was clear. In essence, he can dissolve the Mountain Territory's autonomy and remove me from office if he can demonstrate that personal considerations have compromised my judgment. Can he do that legally? Livia asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. If he can prove that official decisions were made for personal rather than political reasons, yes. Imperial law is quite clear about the separation of private interest and public duty. Septian rose from his chair and began pacing the garden path, his mind working through possibilities and consequences. The Mountain Territory's autonomy agreements could be revoked, new taxation imposed, traditional governance structures dissolved. And you? Removal from office, exile from the province, possible prosecution for abuse of authority. He paused beside the fountain, watching the water catch the morning light. Not exactly the retirement I had envisioned. This is my fault, Livia said, rising to face him across the garden. I should never have come here. I should have known that seeking you out would create exactly this kind of danger. No, Septian's response was immediate and firm. You came here representing your people's legitimate interests, carrying credentials that would command respect anywhere in the empire. If Crassus chooses to see conspiracy where none exists, that speaks to his motivations. Not yours, but our personal connection. Our personal connection is real, but it developed after you arrived on official business. Any reasonable investigation would confirm that the trade agreements we've negotiated serve imperial interests as well as Mountain Territory's needs. He moved back toward her, taking her hands in both of his. The problem isn't what we've done, it's what Crassus hopes to prove. Flavius had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, recognizing the political disaster that was approaching like a storm from the east. Excellency, if I may suggest, perhaps the safest course would be to conclude the mountain negotiations immediately and arrange for the delegation's departure before Crassus arrives. If there's no ongoing contact between you and Lady Livia— No. The interruption came from Livia herself, her voice carrying a strength that surprised both men. Running away won't solve anything. If Crassus suspects personal motivations, my sudden departure will only confirm his suspicions. Besides, abandoning our negotiations now would leave my people completely vulnerable to whatever new arrangements he chooses to impose. Then what do you suggest? Septian asked, though his tone indicated he suspected her answer would be characteristically bold. We finish what we started, but we do it in the most transparent, documented, legally unassailable way possible. Every meeting recorded, every decision justified in writing, every agreement structured to serve clear imperial interests. She moved to the table and gathered the scattered pieces of her broken cup, her movements precise and controlled. If Crassus wants to challenge our motivations, we'll give him a paper trail that would satisfy the most suspicious auditor. And our personal relationship. For the first time since the letter's arrival, Livia's composure wavered slightly. We put it aside until the commission concludes its work. No private meetings, no personal conversations, nothing that could be construed as improper influence. Her voice grew quieter. We protect what we can, and hope that someday circumstances might allow us to explore what we've found together. Septian felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. 3 days ago, he had been a comfortable provincial governor contemplating a quiet retirement. 2 days ago, he had rediscovered hope in the form of a promise kept across 17 years. Now, he faced the possibility of losing everything: his position, his reputation, and the woman who had brought unexpected meaning to his later years. "There may be another option," he said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "Something that could protect both your people's interests and our reputations." What kind of option? "A marriage contract." The words fell into the garden's silence like stones into deep water. Livia stared at him as if he had suddenly begun speaking in tongues, while Flavius made a sound that might have been either a cough or a strangled laugh. "Marriage," Septian continued, his voice growing stronger as the idea developed, "would transform our personal connection from a liability into an asset. Instead of a governor compromised by inappropriate sentiment, Rome would see a strategic alliance that strengthens imperial interests while honoring traditional forms." "You're suggesting," Livia said carefully, "that we marry for political convenience?" "I'm suggesting that we marry for the same reason that little girl promised herself to an emperor 17 years ago, because sometimes the heart recognizes truth that the mind hasn't yet understood." He moved closer, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "The political benefits would simply be a fortunate consequence of following our deeper instincts. And if Crassus sees through such a convenient arrangement, then we face his investigation as husband and wife, legally united in ways that make accusations of improper influence much more difficult to sustain." Septian's voice held a note of something that might have been hope or desperation. "What say you, Livia Marcella? Are you prepared to honor a promise made by a 6-year-old girl to an emperor who never stopped believing in the power of words spoken from the heart?" In the distance, church bells began to ring the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the city like a call to decision. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another day of Mediterranean warmth and beauty, while 3 people stood in a garden that had suddenly become the center of a political storm that would test everything they believed about duty, love, and the courage required to choose both. The 7 days that followed Septian's proposal passed in a whirlwind of preparation that left no time for doubt or second-guessing. If they were to marry before Crassus's arrival, every detail would need to be arranged with both Roman legal precision and the kind of public ceremony that would make their union impossible to question or dismiss. Livia's response to his proposal had been characteristically direct. After a moment of silence that seemed to stretch across centuries, she had looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, not because it's politically convenient, but because that little girl made a promise she intended to keep." Then, with a smile that made his heart skip like a boy's, she had added, "Though I confess the political advantages don't hurt." Now, as he stood in his private study reviewing marriage contracts that Flavius had somehow procured from the provincial archives, Septian found himself marveling at how quickly the impossible could become inevitable. The ancient bronze ring that had belonged to his grandmother lay on the desk before him, a simple band decorated with symbols of fidelity that had waited 60 years to fulfill its purpose. "The mountain elders have given their blessing," Flavius reported, entering with a scroll of approvals and arrangements. Gaius Montanus was particularly emphatic about the honor such a union would bring to their territories. Marcus Silvius asked twice if you were certain about your decision, then declared it the most romantic thing he'd witnessed in 40 years of mountain politics. "And the practical arrangements?" "Complete! The Temple of Jupiter has been reserved for tomorrow morning. The high priest has agreed to conduct the ceremony personally. Apparently, word of your engagement has generated considerable excitement among the city's religious authorities." Flavius settled into his accustomed chair, his expression mixing satisfaction with concern. The public announcement was posted this morning and has already drawn crowds to the forum. It seems half the province wants to witness this wedding. Septian nodded absently, his attention focused on the legal documents spread before him. Marriage contracts in the Roman tradition were complex affairs, requiring careful attention to property rights, inheritance provisions, and the particular circumstances of the parties involved. In their case, those circumstances were unusually complicated. What about the potential challenges from Rome? Have we anticipated every legal objection Crassus might raise? The marriage creates no conflict with existing law. You're both Roman citizens, both of legal age, neither previously married or under legal obligation to another. Flavius consulted his notes. The bride brings no dowry that could suggest financial motivation, and your own wealth remains under separate administration. From a legal perspective, it's an unassailable union, and politically, more complex but defensible. A marriage between a provincial governor and a representative of allied territories could be seen as either strategic alliance building or inappropriate personal indulgence. Much will depend on how the ceremony is conducted and presented. That consideration had dominated their planning from the beginning. This could not appear to be a hasty or secretive arrangement designed to circumvent investigation. Instead, it needed to be a public celebration that demonstrated respect for both Roman tradition and the dignity of the mountain territories. The guest list? Every significant citizen of Valentia, representatives from all the allied territories, and formal invitations sent to Rome announcing the occasion. If Crassus wants to challenge the marriage, he'll have to explain why he objects to a union that has been publicly celebrated and legally recorded. A knock at the door interrupted their review. "Enter," Septian called, expecting another servant with wedding arrangements requiring approval. Instead, Livia herself stepped into the study, and the sight of her took his breath away. She wore a chiton of deep blue silk that had been specially commissioned for the occasion, with her hair arranged in the elaborate style appropriate for a Roman bride. But it was her expression that stopped him, a mixture of anticipation, determination, and something that might have been nervousness. "Forgive the intrusion," she said, her voice carrying traces of the formality she used during diplomatic negotiations. "I wanted to review the marriage contract before tomorrow's ceremony." "Of course." Septian rose and gestured toward the documents. "Though I should warn you, Roman marriage law is notoriously complex. We've tried to structure the agreement to protect both our interests while satisfying legal requirements." She moved to the desk and began examining the contract with the careful attention of someone trained in legal analysis. As she read, Septian found himself studying her face, noting the way her brow furrowed slightly when she encountered particularly dense legal language, the way her lips moved almost imperceptibly as she worked through complex clauses. "This provision about property rights," she said after several minutes. "It maintains complete separation of our estates. Why?" "To prevent any suggestion that marriage was motivated by financial considerations," Flavius explained. "Your mountain properties remain under your control, his provincial holdings under his. No one can claim that wealth changed hands inappropriately, but doesn't that also suggest a marriage of convenience rather than affection? If we truly loved each other, wouldn't we expect to share our lives more completely?" It was a perceptive question that went to the heart of their dilemma. Too much financial entanglement could suggest improper motivation, but too little could imply a purely political arrangement. "There's a middle path," Septian said, reaching for his stylus to make notations on the contract. "We can include provisions for shared household expenses and mutual support while maintaining separate control of inherited properties. It acknowledges the reality of our partnership while protecting both parties' independence." As they worked through the contract's details, Septian found himself increasingly impressed by Livia's legal acumen. She understood the implications of each clause, suggested modifications that strengthened their position, and demonstrated the kind of careful thinking that would serve them well in the challenges ahead. One more matter, she said as they neared the document's end. The ceremony itself. I've been thinking about the words we'll speak, the vows that will bind us together. Traditional Roman vows should suffice, Flavius suggested. They're time-tested and politically neutral, but not personal, Livia countered. If we're to convince anyone that this marriage is genuine, our vows should reflect something real about our connection. Not just legal formulas, but words that speak to why we're choosing this path. Septian set down his stylus and looked at her directly. What did you have in mind? Something that acknowledges our history, the promise made by a child and kept by a woman. Something that speaks to the recognition we felt when we saw each other again. Something that suggests this union grows from real feeling rather than mere convenience. That's dangerous territory, Flavius warned. The more personal the ceremony becomes, the more vulnerable you are to accusations of inappropriate sentiment, overwhelming professional judgment. Perhaps, Livia agreed. But the alternative is a ceremony so obviously calculated that it convinces no one. Better to risk accusations of genuine feeling than confirmations of political manipulation. Septian found himself torn between admiration for her courage and concern for the risks she was willing to take. What specific words were you considering? Something like this. She cleared her throat and spoke with the clear delivery of her rhetorical training. I, Livia Marcella, come to you not as a stranger seeking alliance, but as a woman honoring a promise made in childhood and discovered in maturity. I offer you not just my hand in marriage, but my partnership in the work of governance, my counsel in times of difficulty, and my faith in the wisdom of two hearts that recognized each other across the span of years. The words fell into the study's silence like music into an expectant hall. Septian felt something tighten in his chest, not anxiety, but recognition of truth spoken without calculation or artifice. And my response, he asked quietly, should be equally honest. You could acknowledge that you've waited for something you never expected to find, that this marriage represents not political strategy, but the fulfillment of hope you barely dared to maintain. Such words could be seen as admission that personal feeling has influenced official decisions, or they could be seen as evidence that two people capable of keeping promises across 17 years are also capable of maintaining appropriate boundaries between personal and professional responsibilities. Livia's voice carried the confidence of someone who had thought through all the implications. Which interpretation prevails will depend largely on how we conduct ourselves after the ceremony. Speaking of which, Flavius interjected, we should discuss the immediate arrangements. Where will you live? How will household management be structured? What changes in daily routine will be necessary to accommodate married life while maintaining governmental responsibilities? It was a practical question that highlighted how much would change after tomorrow's ceremony. Septian had lived alone in the imperial quarters for nearly 2 decades, maintaining the comfortable routines of a man whose primary relationship was with his work. Marriage would require adjustments that went far beyond legal formalities. I assume I'll move to the imperial quarters, Livia said. The mountain delegation can continue occupying the guest quarters until their business is concluded, but it would be inappropriate for a wife to maintain separate residence. That will require some reorganization, Septian mused. The quarters were designed for a single occupant. We'll need additional space for your belongings, arrangements for your scholarly work, accommodation for any servants you require. I require very little, she said with a smile. A desk, adequate lighting for reading, and shelves for my books. The mountains taught me to live simply. What about your work as a scholar? Will marriage interfere with your academic pursuits? Only if you forbid them, which I hope you won't. I'd like to continue my studies and perhaps establish a small school here in Valentia. The province would benefit from increased literacy and legal education. The suggestion delighted him. An excellent idea. We have suitable space in the eastern wing that could be converted to classrooms and library. Your teaching would serve the province's interests while providing you with meaningful work. As they continued planning, Septian found himself increasingly amazed by how naturally their lives seemed to fit together. Despite the vast differences in their ages and backgrounds, they appeared to share fundamental values about service, learning, and the importance of keeping faith with those who depended on them. "One final matter," he said, as the afternoon light began to fade. "Tomorrow's ceremony will be observed by hundreds of people, including those who may report to Crassus upon his arrival. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" "I've been preparing for it my entire life," Livia replied with quiet confidence. "Tomorrow I keep a promise made by a little girl who believed an emperor when he said he would wait for her. Everything else, the politics, the challenges, the investigations, we'll face together as husband and wife." "Together," Septian repeated, testing the weight of the word. After so many years of bearing responsibility alone, the concept of true partnership felt both foreign and deeply appealing. "Together," she confirmed, and in her voice he heard the same certainty that had marked her childhood declaration 17 years earlier. "Whatever comes, we'll meet it as we should have met it from the beginning, as two people who believe that some promises are worth keeping, no matter what the cost." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with the Mediterranean sun casting golden light across the marble columns of Jupiter's temple. By the time the ceremony was scheduled to begin, the forum had filled with more citizens than Septian had ever seen gathered for a single event. Word of the emperor's marriage to the mountain scholar had spread throughout the province, drawing people from villages and settlements that rarely participated in imperial occasions. Septian stood at the altar in his finest ceremonial toga, the purple stripe brilliant against the white wool, his graying hair crowned with a wreath of olive leaves that symbolized peace and prosperity. Beside him, the high priest Gaius Maximus waited with the sacred implements of Roman marriage, the ceremonial knife, the offering bowl, and the ancient words that would bind two lives together under the protection of the gods. "Nervous?" Flavius asked quietly from his position as witness and advisor. "Terrified," Septian admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "Not of marriage, of failing her. She's risking everything on the hope that we can make this work." Before Flavius could respond, a murmur from the crowd announced Livia's arrival. Septian turned toward the temple entrance and felt his breath catch in his throat. She approached with measured dignity, wearing a traditional Roman bride's ensemble, a white tunic bound with a cord of wool, a flame-colored veil that covered her hair, and flowers woven into a crown that caught the morning light like scattered stars. But it was her expression that stopped his heart. Beneath the formal wedding attire, he saw the same serious brown eyes that had looked up at him 17 years ago, now shining with a mixture of joy and determination that made him understand, perhaps for the first time, that this moment was the fulfillment of something much deeper than political necessity. She was accompanied by the mountain elders who had insisted on the honor of presenting her for marriage, and a small procession of Valentia's most prominent citizens. As she drew closer to the altar, Septian found himself remembering every detail of their first meeting, the way she had tugged at his cloak, the absolute certainty in her child's voice, the promise he had made without ever imagining it would be tested by time and circumstance. "Citizens of Valentia," the high priest's voice rang across the forum. "We gather this day to witness the union of Emperor Septian, guardian of our province, and Livia Marcella, scholar of Athens and representative of the mountain territories. Let all who have objection to this marriage speak now or forever hold their peace." The silence that followed was complete and profound. Hundreds of people held their breath, waiting to see if any voice would rise in challenge. When none did, Gaius Maximus nodded approval and gestured for the couple to approach the altar. "Emperor Septian," the priest intoned, "do you take this woman as your wife? To honor and protect, to cherish and support, in times of joy and sorrow, in strength and weakness, until death parts you?" "I do," Septian replied, his voice carrying clearly across the forum. "And I make this additional vow, that I honor not only the woman who stands before me today, but the child who had the courage to speak truth to power, and the promise that has bound our hearts across 17 years of separation. A ripple of emotion passed through the crowd. These were words that went beyond legal formality, speaking to something deeper and more personal than most public ceremonies allowed. "Livia Marcella," the priest continued, "do you take this man as your husband, to honor and support, to counsel and comfort, in times of prosperity and adversity, in health and illness until death parts you?" "I do," Livia replied, her voice strong and clear. "And I vow that this marriage grows not from convenience or calculation, but from recognition, the recognition of two souls who understood even in our first meeting that some connections transcend the ordinary boundaries of age and station and expectation." Septian felt tears gather in his eyes as she spoke the words they had crafted together. Around them, the crowd had grown completely still, sensing that they were witnessing something rare and precious, a ceremony that spoke to genuine feeling rather than mere political. "Alliance," the priest raised the ceremonial knife and asked for the ritual offerings. Septian placed his hand over Livia's as they together poured wine onto the altar, symbolizing the joining of their lives and fortunes. The sacred fire flared bright as their offerings fed the flames, and Gaius Maximus spoke the ancient words that declared them husband and wife under Roman law and divine blessing. "By the authority vested in me by the gods and the Roman people," he proclaimed, "I declare you lawfully wed. May your union bring peace to your hearts, prosperity to your house, and wisdom to your governance." The crowd erupted in celebration, cheers, applause, and the throwing of flower petals that filled the air with color and fragrance. Septian turned to his new wife and saw in her eyes the same joy and wonder he felt in his own heart. When he kissed her, it was not the formal gesture of a political alliance, but the expression of something that had been growing between them since the moment of reunion. But even as they basked in the moment's joy, a messenger was already riding hard from the east, carrying news that would test everything they had just promised each other. Senator Crassus and his investigative commission had arrived 3 days early and were approaching Valentia with questions that would challenge not just their political arrangements, but the very foundation of the marriage they had just celebrated before the gods and witnesses. The wedding feast was still underway when the messenger arrived, his horse's hooves clattering against the marble stones of the forum like an ominous drumbeat. Septian and Livia sat at the head table beneath a canopy of silk and flowers, accepting congratulations from a steady stream of well-wishers. When Flavius appeared at Septian's shoulder with an expression that immediately sobered the celebration's mood, "Senator Crassus has arrived," he said quietly, his words barely audible above the music and laughter. "His advance guard is already establishing a camp outside the city walls. He requests immediate audience with your excellency." Livia's hand found Septian's beneath the table, her fingers cool and steady despite the gravity of the news.
"How much time do we have?"
"He's demanded meeting within the hour. Claims urgent imperial business that cannot wait for social conveniences." Flavius's tone made clear his opinion of such presumption. His exact words were that marriage festivities don't excuse neglect of duty to Rome. Septian felt the weight of challenge settle on his shoulders like armor before battle. This was the moment they had prepared for, the test that would determine whether the union could withstand official scrutiny or whether both their futures would be destroyed by accusations they could not refute. "Then we meet him," Septian said, rising from his chair. The gesture drew attention from nearby guests, and gradually the celebration's noise diminished as people sensed that something significant was occurring. "Citizens of Valentia," he called out, his voice carrying the authority that had governed them for 17 years. "We have received word that Senator Marcus Crassus, representing the Senate and people of Rome, has arrived to conduct official business. As your emperor, I must attend to these duties, but I want you to know that this marriage, our marriage, represents not the abandonment of responsibility, but its fulfillment in new form." He turned to Livia, extending his hand to help her rise. My wife and I will face whatever challenges await us together, as we promised before you and the gods. Continue your celebration with our blessing, and know that whatever the future holds, we face it united in purpose and commitment. The crowd's response was immediate and heartfelt, applause that spoke not just of respect for their emperor, but of genuine affection for a couple whose love story had captured the imagination of an entire province. As Septian and Livia made their way toward the palace, people pressed forward to touch their hands, offer blessings, and express support that felt like a protective embrace. Senator Marcus Crassus awaited them in the great throne room, having apparently installed himself without invitation or ceremony. He was a man in his 50s, lean and sharp-featured, with the calculating eyes of someone who measured every interaction in terms of advantage gained or lost. His retinue of scribes and legal advisors had arranged themselves with military precision, creating an atmosphere more suited to a tribunal than a diplomatic meeting. Emperor Septian, Crassus said without rising. A breach of protocol that was clearly deliberate. How convenient that you've managed to conclude your festivities in time for our discussion, Senator Crassus, Septian replied, his voice carrying the measured dignity of his office. Welcome to Valentia. May I present my wife, Livia Marcella, scholar of Athens and representative of the mountain territories. Ah, yes, the mountain representative. Crassus's gaze shifted to Livia with the predatory focus of a hunting cat. How remarkably convenient that your diplomatic mission should result in marriage to the very official whose support you sought. One might almost suspect such an outcome was planned rather than spontaneous. One might, Livia replied calmly, if one were predisposed to see conspiracy where affection exists, or calculation where recognition occurs. But such suspicions often reveal more about the accuser's character than the accused's motivations. The response was perfectly pitched, acknowledging the challenge, while turning it back on Crassus himself. Septian felt a surge of admiration for his wife's diplomatic skill, even as he recognized that they were walking through a minefield where any misstep could prove catastrophic. Let us dispense with pleasantries, Crassus said, gesturing to his scribes. I am here to investigate reports that provincial governance has been compromised by personal relationships, that official decisions have been made to benefit particular individuals rather than serve imperial interests. I welcome such investigation, Septian replied. My governance of Valentia has always prioritized the province's welfare and Rome's interests. Any examination of my policies and decisions will confirm this, including your unusually generous treatment of the mountain territories. Your resistance to taxation increases that would serve imperial revenue. Your marriage to a woman whose people benefit directly from your official decisions. Crassus's questions came rapid fire, designed to overwhelm and confuse. My treatment of the mountain territories honors existing agreements made by previous emperors and confirmed by Rome itself. My resistance to taxation increases reflects assessment that excessive burden would damage long-term revenue by disrupting trade. My marriage occurred after our negotiations were concluded and affects no existing arrangements. Septian's responses were equally measured and precise, yet remarkably convenient timing. Wouldn't you agree? Marriage that transforms potential conflict of interest into legal spousal unity? Marriage that fulfills a promise made 17 years ago by two people who recognized something in each other that transcended political calculation, Livia interjected. Senator, are you suggesting that personal affection between Roman citizens is somehow inappropriate or suspicious? The question hung in the throne room's marble air like a challenge that demanded answer. Crassus had come expecting to find evidence of corruption and conspiracy, but instead faced a couple whose public union enjoyed popular support and legal protection. The real battle was about to begin. The investigation lasted 3 days, during which Crassus and his commission examined every document, questioned every witness, and scrutinized every decision Septian had made regarding the mountain territories. They found meticulous records, transparent negotiations, and agreements that served both imperial interests and regional stability. More frustrating for Crassus, they found widespread support for both the emperor's governance and his marriage, from citizens who spoke with genuine affection rather than manufactured loyalty. On the afternoon of the third day, as Crassus prepared his final report, an unexpected visitor arrived at the palace gates. Marcus Aurelius himself, Emperor of Rome, had come to Valentia unannounced, traveling with a small retinue that suggested personal rather than official business. Septian and Livia received him in the great throne room, the same space where Crassus had conducted his investigation, but where the senator had created an atmosphere of suspicion and hostility. The emperor's presence brought a sense of wisdom and measured judgment that immediately changed the room's dynamic. "Rise." "My friend," Marcus Aurelius said as Septian began the formal genuflection. "We are not here for ceremony, but for understanding." His gaze moved to Livia with genuine curiosity. "And you must be the scholar who has captured not only our provincial governor's heart, but the imagination of half the empire. Word of your wedding has reached Rome with remarkable speed." "Your Majesty honors us with your presence," Livia replied, executing a perfect bow that acknowledged his rank while maintaining her own dignity. "Though I confess surprise at finding myself the subject of imperial attention. Love stories have a way of traveling faster than official dispatches," the emperor observed with amusement, "particularly when they involve promises kept across decades and marriages that unite not just two people, but two communities." He turned to Crassus, who had been standing in rigid attention since the emperor's arrival. "Senator, what have your investigations revealed?" "Your Majesty," Crassus began, his earlier confidence notably diminished, "the evidence suggests that while Emperor Septian's policies have been generous toward the mountain territories, they fall within legal bounds and serve legitimate imperial interests. The marriage appears to be genuine rather than calculated, though its timing remains convenient." "Convenient for whom?" Marcus Aurelius asked mildly. "For an elderly governor seeking political protection? For a young scholar advancing her people's interests? Or for an empire that benefits when its provincial representatives build bridges rather than walls?" The question carried implications that made Crassus visibly uncomfortable. "Your Majesty, I merely sought to ensure that personal considerations hadn't compromised official judgment." "A worthy goal. And what did you conclude?" "That Emperor Septian has governed with integrity and wisdom, that his marriage enjoys popular support, and that the mountain territories have remained loyal and prosperous under existing arrangements." Crassus's admission came reluctantly, but he was too experienced a politician to misrepresent findings to the emperor himself. "Excellent." Marcus Aurelius moved to the window that overlooked the forum, where citizens continued their daily routines in peaceful prosperity. "Septian, walk with me. I would hear your thoughts on governance, marriage, and the curious ways that personal happiness sometimes serves public good." They descended to the garden, where Septian had spent so many contemplative hours, the emperor moving with the careful gait of a man whose philosophical nature was housed in an aging body. Marcus Aurelius paused beside the fountain, where Septian had first wrestled with memories of a little girl's promise. "Tell me about her," the emperor said without preamble. "Not the scholar or the diplomat, but the child who made such an impression that you remembered her across 17 years. Septian found himself recounting that long ago afternoon, the boldness of a 6-year-old who spoke to an emperor without fear, the promise made in innocence and kept through wisdom, the recognition that some connections transcend the ordinary boundaries of time and circumstance. And when she returned, I knew her immediately. Not just her face, but something deeper. The same courage, the same integrity, the same refusal to be anything other than exactly who she was." Septian's voice grew quiet. "She could have used our childhood connection for political advantage, but instead she tried to protect me from any consequences of our relationship. She put my welfare above her mission's success, the mark of genuine affection, Marcus Aurelius observed. And your decision to marry? Made not from political calculation, but from the recognition that some gifts from the gods should not be refused simply because they arrive in unexpected forms. Septian paused, watching sunlight dance on the fountain's water. I am an old man who thought his life story was already written. She showed me that sometimes the most important chapters begin when we least expect them. The emperor nodded thoughtfully. I came here expecting to find either corruption requiring correction or innocence requiring protection. Instead, I find something rarer, a reminder that the empire's strength lies not just in its laws and armies, but in the connections between people who choose to serve something larger than themselves. They returned to the throne room, where Livia waited with Flavius and the mountain elders. The afternoon light slanting through tall windows to illuminate faces marked by hope and apprehension. Citizens, Marcus Aurelius announced, after thorough investigation, I find that Emperor Septian has governed Valentia with exceptional wisdom and integrity. His marriage to Livia Marcella strengthens rather than compromises his ability to serve imperial interests. The mountain territory's autonomy is confirmed, their tax arrangements validated, and their representation through this union recognized as beneficial to all parties. He turned to Crassus with a slight smile. Senator, your diligence in protecting imperial interests is commendable, but in this case unnecessary. Some unions serve the state precisely because they grow from genuine affection rather than political convenience. As the formal pronouncements concluded and the various officials departed, Septian and Livia found themselves alone in the garden where their story had begun its final chapter. The bronze ring on her finger caught the evening light, while his eyes held the contentment of a man who had learned that the universe occasionally arranges better endings than any mortal mind could devise. Well, wife, he said, taking her hand as they walked among the olive trees he had planted years earlier. It seems our promise has survived both time and investigation. Did you ever doubt it would? She asked, her voice carrying traces of the confidence that had marked her childhood declaration. Never, he replied, and realized as he spoke the word that it was completely true. Some promises once made from the heart become as inevitable as sunrise, not because they are easy to keep, but because they are impossible to abandon. In the distance, the citizens of Valentia went about their evening routines, secure in the knowledge that their emperor had found not just political alliance, but the kind of love that poets celebrated and philosophers struggled to explain. And in the palace garden, two people who had waited 17 years to understand the full meaning of a child's promise finally came home to each other, exactly as they had always known they would.